The transmission did not arrive through any known channel. It did not ping, request authentication, or wait its turn in the endless traffic of interstellar signals. It simply appeared, already inside every human network at once, already decoded, already understood, as if whatever had sent it had known exactly where to speak and how to be heard. For 12 seconds, every military system, civilian grid, and deep space relay on Earth went perfectly silent. Not offline. Not disrupted. Silent. As if something vast had placed a hand over the mouth of an entire civilization and said, "Wait." Then the message began. It was not long. It did not need to be. Humanity was instructed to dismantle its outer defense lattice within 7 standard days. All autonomous patrol zones were to be deactivated. All expansion beyond current territorial boundaries would cease indefinitely. Compliance would ensure preservation. Refusal would trigger what the message described, with chilling simplicity, as civilizational correction. There were no threats attached. No demonstrations of force. No attempt at intimidation beyond the certainty in its wording. It read less like a warning and more like a statement of something that had already been decided. But that was not what froze the room when the message reached Earth's strategic coordination chamber. It was the number. Buried in the final line, almost casually, was a precise accounting of humanity's active fleet strength, every registered warship, every deep-range carrier, every patrol-class vessel currently deployed beyond the inner system. The number was exact. No one spoke for several seconds after the transmission ended. Not because they did not understand what it meant, but because they did. Someone out there was not guessing. Someone out there knew. Admiral Soren Hale stood at the far end of the chamber, hands resting lightly against the cold surface of the command table. He did not react the way the others did. There was no visible tension in his posture, no rush to issue orders, no immediate demand for verification. He simply watched the frozen display, reading the message again as if it contained something no one else had noticed yet. Around him, the room came back to life in fragments, voices rising, projections flaring, overlapping reports of signal origin, encryption anomalies, and impossible entry vectors. Analysts began pulling fleet registries, cross-checking classifications, searching for discrepancies that might prove the number wrong. There were none. "It's accurate," someone said quietly, the words landing heavier than any alarm. Hale nodded once, as if that confirmed something rather than surprised him. "They're inviting a reaction," one of the council members pressed, already leaning forward, already calculating countermeasures. "We mobilize now, we show strength, we—" "No," Hale said. The word cut through the room without force, but it stopped everything. Every eye turned toward him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We do not move the fleet." The silence that followed was different this time. Not shock. Not confusion. Something closer to disbelief. "They know exactly what we have," another voice pushed back. "If we stay still, we look exposed." Hale finally looked up from the message, his gaze steady, almost distant, as if he were already several steps ahead of the conversation everyone else was trying to have. "Yes," he said. "That's what they think." The pause. Just long enough to feel intentional. Then he reached out and enlarged a single line of the transmission, the smallest detail, barely noticeable unless someone had been looking for it. "They counted our ships," he said quietly, "which means they're preparing to fight a fleet." No one spoke. Hale's expression did not change, but something in the room shifted all the same. "They don't understand how we survive," he added. And somewhere, buried beneath the certainty of the ultimatum, that realization opened a question no one in that room could yet answer. If the enemy knew everything they thought mattered, what exactly had they missed? The chamber did not erupt into chaos after Hale's statement. That was the first sign something had shifted. Normally, a directive like that, refusing immediate mobilization in the face of a quantified threat, would have triggered argument, escalation, demands for override authority. Instead, the room hesitated. Because Hale had not sounded uncertain. He had sounded familiar with this. "What exactly are you suggesting they missed?" Counselor Imani asked, her voice measured but edged with urgency. She had spent her entire career navigating crises that followed predictable patterns. Escalation, response, counter-response. This did not feel like any of those. Hale did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the main display. Bring up the outer lattice. A moment later, the projection shifted. Hundreds of faint markers appeared, scattered across the frontier regions. Defense nodes, relay hubs, logistics anchors. To most in the room, it looked exactly as it always had. Functional, distributed, nothing extraordinary. They see this, Hale said. A defensive perimeter. A structure designed to hold territory. And it is, one of the generals replied. Hale tilted his head slightly. Is it? The question hung longer than it should have. Before anyone could press further, a new feed pushed onto the display, live updates from the frontier colonies. Freight routes adjusting by fractional degrees. Civilian traffic thinning in some sectors, increasing in others. Power signatures dipping in a pattern too subtle to trigger alarms, but too consistent to be random. These changes started 12 minutes before the transmission arrived, an analyst reported. We didn't issue any commands. Hale's expression did not change. Of course we didn't, he said. Now the room shifted again, this time with unease. Across the system, millions of people were moving, not in panic, not in evacuation, but with quiet, almost procedural precision. Cargo ships rerouted without urgency. Habitation clusters adjusting internal energy loads. Communication relays redistributing bandwidth as if anticipating stress points that had not yet formed. No broadcast had ordered it. No alarm had triggered it. Yet it was happening. Someone needs to explain how half the frontier just decided to reorganize itself without being told. Imani said, sharper now. They were told, Hale replied. Just not today. That answer landed harder than any alarm. A junior officer, barely out of training, stepped forward hesitantly. Sir, these patterns, they match something. Show it, Hale said. The display split. On one side, the current movements. On the other, an archived file, time-stamped years earlier. A simulation. Not a battle scenario. Not a war game. A contingency. The patterns aligned almost perfectly. Silence spread again, but this time it carried weight. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. They built this in advance, the officer said, his voice quieter now, as if saying it too loudly might make it more real. All of it. The traffic, the power redistribution, the relay shifts, it's a system-wide response. To what? Someone demanded. Hale finally turned from the display. To being measured, he said. That word settled differently. Measured. Not attacked. Not threatened. Observed. A realization began to take shape, slow and uncomfortable. The transmission had not just been a demand. It had been a probe. A way to watch how humanity reacted under pressure, to confirm models, to refine assumptions. And humanity had responded exactly as expected. Or so the enemy believed. They counted our ships, Hale repeated, softer now. They watched our deployments. They mapped our structure. He paused, letting the next part sit just out of reach for a moment. They think they understand what matters. No one interrupted him this time. Because now there was something else in the room. Not panic. Not even fear. Something closer to anticipation. Imani folded her arms, studying him carefully. And what doesn't matter? Hale looked back at the display, at the fleets, the nodes, the endless markers that defined humanity's visible strength. Then, almost as an afterthought, he reached out and dimmed them. Hundreds of points faded from view, leaving behind only a handful of faint signals. Irregular, scattered, easy to overlook. These, he said. The room leaned in. They didn't count these. The junior officer frowned. Because they're insignificant? Hale's gaze flicked toward him, just for a second. No, he said. Because they don't look like anything at all. That was the moment it shifted again. Because if the enemy had counted everything that looked important, then what exactly had humanity hidden inside the things that didn't? And more importantly, why had Hale just allowed the enemy to see exactly what they expected? The first response from beyond human space did not come as another ultimatum. It came as a request. That alone unsettled the chamber more than the original threat ever had. No hostile signatures followed the transmission. No weapon platforms moved into striking range. Instead, a single vessel, small by comparison to the fleet it represented, slipped into the outer edge of human-controlled space and stopped. It did not advance. It did not deploy. It simply waited, broadcasting a diplomatic channel request with a precision that suggested absolute confidence it would be answered. "They're adjusting," Imani said under her breath. Hale didn't look surprised. "They're confirming." Within the hour, the decision was made. The channel would be opened. Not because humanity lacked options, but because refusing it would answer too many questions too quickly. The envoy appeared as a projection in the chamber, tall, composed, with features that seemed engineered for clarity rather than expression. There was no arrogance in its posture, but there was no uncertainty either. It spoke like something accustomed to being correct. "The coalition acknowledges receipt of your silence," it began. "We have allowed time for internal resolution. We are prepared to clarify terms." No mention of negotiation. No acknowledgement that the situation might not unfold as planned. Hale stepped forward, his presence quiet but undeniable. "Clarification won't be necessary," he said. "We understood the message." The envoy's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on him. "Then your compliance timeline is understood." A subtle tension tightened in the room. This was the moment most civilizations faltered. The moment where pressure turned into concession. Hale didn't move. "No," he said calmly. "What we understood was your assumption." The envoy paused. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Explain," it said. Hale took a single step closer to the projection, close enough that the faint distortion of the display brushed against his uniform. "You counted our fleet," he said. "You mapped our defenses. You built a model of what you believe we are." "That model is sufficient," the envoy replied. "Your capabilities fall within expected parameters." Hale's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, just enough to suggest the conversation had already moved somewhere the envoy hadn't anticipated. "That's the problem," he said, as silence followed, heavier this time. Across the chamber, analysts monitored every microfluctuation in the envoy's signal, every adjustment in its posture. There were no obvious tells, no emotional leakage. But the pause was longer now. "You are suggesting our assessment is flawed," the envoy said. "I'm telling you it's incomplete," Hale replied. Another pause. This one was measured. The envoy did not respond immediately. Instead, it adjusted its stance slightly, as if recalibrating the interaction itself. "Your species has not demonstrated capabilities beyond those we have catalogued," it said finally. Hale's gaze didn't waver. "That depends on what you've been looking for." That line lingered longer than anything else he had said, because it reframed everything. The coalition had not just been gathering data, they had been filtering it, deciding what mattered, ignoring what didn't. And somewhere in that process, something had slipped through. The envoy's tone shifted, subtly but unmistakably. "Then provide correction." There was the first crack. Not in power. Not in authority. In certainty. Hale could have answered directly. Could have revealed a fraction of what lay beneath the surface, enough to disrupt the coalition's confidence completely. He didn't. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He shook his head. "No," he said. "You need to see it." The envoy's posture stilled. "See what?" it asked. Hale didn't answer. "Not directly." "Continue your observations," he said instead. "Measure what you think matters. Build your projections. Move forward exactly as your models tell you to." A faint ripple moved through the analysts behind the glass partitions. Even they hadn't expected that. Imani turned slightly toward him, her voice low. "You're letting them proceed." "Yes," Hale said. "They could commit to a strike." "They won't," he replied. There was no hesitation in it. "Because," she pressed. Hale's eyes remained fixed on the envoy. "Because they believe they understand the outcome," he said. "And until that belief breaks, they'll follow it." The envoy spoke again, its voice carrying a new, almost imperceptible edge. You are choosing not to contest our position. Hale finally allowed the smallest hint of something to surface. Not a smile, not quite, but something close to recognition. No, he said quietly. We're choosing not to interrupt it. The line landed like a weight in the room. Because now the implication was unavoidable. Humanity wasn't preparing to stop the coalition. It was preparing to let them step deeper. The envoy held its position for several seconds longer than before, its stillness no longer neutral but deliberate. Something was being processed, something that didn't fit cleanly into its existing framework. Then, without further comment, the projection dissolved. The channel closed. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. Then the junior officer, the same one who had spotted the contingency pattern, exhaled slowly. They're going to keep watching, he said. Hale nodded once. Yes. And when they do, the officer continued, his voice tightening slightly, they're going to see exactly what we showed them. Hale turned away from the darkened projection, his gaze drifting back to the faint signals still scattered across the display, the ones that didn't look like anything at all. They'll see what we want them to see, he said. The pause. Then quieter. And they'll miss what they can't imagine. Across the outer systems, the coalition's sensors began their work again. Quiet scans. Passive readings. Long-range observation. They mapped power outputs. Tracked movement patterns. Measured fleet distribution. And piece by piece, they built a picture. A careful one. A thorough one. A picture that made sense. A picture that confirmed their expectations. The picture that was, in ways they would not yet realize, wrong. The coalition did not rush. That was the first deviation from every prior encounter humanity had studied. Instead of committing overwhelming force or escalating pressure, their fleets slowed to a deliberate crawl at the edge of contested space. Observation platforms multiplied. Signal density increased. Entire sectors became saturated with passive scans so refined they bordered on intrusive. They were not attacking. They were learning. And that, more than anything, unsettled the people who understood what Hale was doing. They're not taking the bait, Imani said 3 days later, standing over a shifting projection of coalition probe paths. The patterns were tight, controlled, methodical. No overextension. No reckless advance. Hale studied the same projection without visible concern. They are, he said. Just not the way you expected. Imani turned toward him sharply. If they don't commit, your entire framework stalls. You said it yourself, this only works if they step into it. They will, Hale replied. There it was again. That certainty. Not hopeful. Not speculative. Absolute. But the margin for error was narrowing. Across the frontier, human systems continued their quiet transformation. Civilian networks adapted. Resource flows shifted. Colonies recalibrated themselves into something less visible, less predictable. To an outside observer, it still resembled disorganization. Systems under stress, structures compensating imperfectly. But inside the network, it was something else entirely. A pattern. One that only worked if the enemy moved far enough to trigger it. And the coalition was not moving far enough. Sir, the junior officer said, stepping forward with a new data set, their probes are focusing on supply continuity. They're mapping our sustainment capability, not our defenses. Hale glanced at the display. Of course they are. They're not trying to break us, the officer continued. They're trying to understand how long we last. That realization spread through the room like a slow burn, because it meant the coalition had adjusted its model. They no longer believed humanity would collapse under pressure alone. They were preparing to outlast them. Imani folded her arms, her expression tightening. If they stay outside the threshold, we lose the advantage. They can pick us apart slowly. Economically. Logistically. We won't even see the collapse until it's already happening. Hale didn't respond immediately. For the first time, there was a pause in him. Not uncertainty, but calculation. They won't stay patient forever, he said finally. That's not a plan, she shot back. That's a hope. Hale looked at her then, properly this time. No, he said quietly. It's a pressure point. Before she could respond, the room shifted again. An alert. Not a system-wide alarm. Not a fleet engagement. Something smaller. Localized. Colony Sigma 9 just took a hit, an analyst reported, voice tightening as the data streamed in. Precision strike. Orbital infrastructure disabled. Minimal warning. The projection snapped to life. Sigma 9, a mid-tier colony, strategically unremarkable, lightly defended, burned in silent fragments across the display. Its outer grid was gone. Communication arrays severed. Power systems collapsing in cascading failures. No follow-up strike. No invasion force. Just a single, surgical blow. A test, someone said. Hale didn't correct them. Because that's exactly what it was. They wanted to see how we respond under real damage, the junior officer whispered. Imani turned to Hale immediately. We need to respond. If we don't, they escalate. Hale's eyes remained on the projection. On the colony. On the damage. On the pattern forming around it. No, he said. The word landed harder this time. They just destroyed a civilian node, she pressed, anger breaking through now. If we do nothing, we confirm their model. And if we react, Hale said, still calm, we confirm it faster. The room went still again. Because both options felt wrong. Across the display, Sigma 9's remaining systems began to flicker, emergency protocols activating, internal structures sealing, population clusters redistributing into hardened zones. Not panic. Not collapse. Adaptation. Deliberate. As if the colony had been waiting for this moment. They knew, the junior officer said, staring at the data. They knew exactly what to do. Hale nodded once. They were trained for it. Imani's voice lowered, something colder beneath the anger now. You're letting this happen. Hale didn't deny it. Yes. The honesty of it made it worse. They're measuring us, he continued. Not just our strength. Our thresholds. Our behavior under loss. He finally turned away from the burning projection, his gaze shifting back to the broader map. And we're giving them exactly what they expect to see. Imani stared at him. At the cost of our own people? Hale's expression didn't change. But something in his voice did. Only if you think this is where the cost ends. That stopped her. Because it reframed the strike. Not as an isolated event. But as part of something larger. Something already in motion. On the display, Sigma 9's signal stabilized. Faint, reduced, but intact. Its systems had not failed. They had shifted. Power signatures dropped. Emissions flattened. Activity levels reduced to something barely distinguishable from background noise. To an external observer, it looked crippled. To anyone watching closely, it looked like it had disappeared on purpose. The junior officer leaned in, eyes narrowing. They're not just recovering. He pulled up the surrounding sector. The corridor around Sigma 9, previously empty, strategically irrelevant, now showed subtle fluctuations. Irregular. Easy to ignore. Unless you were looking for them. They're shaping space, he said, almost to himself. Hale didn't correct him. Because that was exactly what they were doing. Across Coalition Command, the data from Sigma 9 fed into their models. A weak point identified. A system damaged. A response measured. A conclusion forming. And just beyond their current observation range. Something else was waiting. Imani's voice came quieter now, less certain than before. If they push through that sector. Hale nodded slightly. They will. And when they do? For the first time since the transmission arrived, Hale allowed a fraction of the truth to surface. Then they'll stop measuring, he said. The pause. They'll start committing. He looked back at Sigma 9, at the damaged colony, now dim and silent against the void. And then beyond it. To the empty corridor the Coalition had just marked as vulnerable. They just chose their path, he said softly. What no one in that room said out loud. What no one was ready to say yet. Was the question that now mattered more than anything else. If that path had been chosen for them, then what exactly had humanity built waiting at the other end? The Coalition did not hesitate for long. 3 days after the strike on Sigma 9, Their first major task force crossed the invisible line that separated observation from commitment. It moved exactly as their models predicted it would: tight formation, controlled velocity, layered sensor sweeps mapping every variable ahead of them. To their analysts, the corridor beyond Sigma 9 represented a weakness: reduced power output, disrupted infrastructure, minimal defensive clustering. It was, by every measurable standard, the most efficient path forward. From Earth's command chamber, the projection of their advance unfolded in silence. "They're taking it," the junior officer said, unable to hide the tension in his voice. "Full commitment vector. They believe the sector is compromised." Hale did not respond immediately. He simply watched. Because everything about this moment mattered. The first hour passed without incident. Coalition ships advanced steadily, their sensors confirming exactly what they expected. Scattered debris fields from Sigma 9 degraded. Signal integrity, fragmented human presence. No concentrated fleet response. No defensive wall. To them, it looked like confirmation. To humanity, it was the beginning. "Distance to threshold?" Imani asked. 3 minutes, came the reply. No alarms sounded. No commands were shouted. Hale folded his hands behind his back, his posture as still as it had been since the beginning. "Hold," he said quietly. The coalition crossed the threshold. Nothing happened. For 11 seconds, nothing changed. Then their formation began to drift. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm. But enough that the tight precision of their advance loosened by a fraction. Navigation variance detected, an analyst on the coalition side reported through intercepted chatter. Minor deviation, correcting. They adjusted. Or tried to. Because the correction did not align. Their ships compensated for drift that didn't behave like drift. Vectors recalculated, but each recalculation produced a new inconsistency, small, compounding, subtle. From Earth's side, the junior officer leaned forward, eyes locked on the data. "It's starting," he whispered. "What exactly is starting?" Imani asked, her voice tight. Hale answered without looking away from the display. "They're entering a system that doesn't behave the way they expect." Across the corridor, coalition sensors intensified their scans. Power readings flickered, faint, inconsistent signals appearing where none had been detected before. Not enough to classify. Not enough to identify. Just enough to exist. Unknown emissions, one coalition report stated. Low priority. But the emissions didn't fade. They multiplied. Small clusters of activity emerged along their path. Abandoned relay stations reactivating just long enough to transmit false routing data before going dark again. Civilian freight containers, supposedly empty, shifted position in micro-adjustments that altered spatial reference points. None of it was aggressive. None of it was overt. But all of it interfered. "They're not attacking," the junior officer said, realization dawning in his voice. "They're changing the environment." Hale nodded once. "Yes." The coalition advanced further. Their models adjusted. And adjusted again. Each time, the picture remained logical. Each anomaly explained individually. Each inconsistency absorbed into a system that still appeared manageable. But the accumulation was something else. Fuel distribution began to misalign with projected consumption. Signal relays carried delayed echoes that distorted timing calculations. Supply drones reported clear paths that, moments later, no longer existed in the same configuration. "They're feeding them bad information," Imani said, eyes narrowing. "No," Hale replied softly. "They're feeding them accurate information." She turned to him sharply. "That doesn't make sense." "It does," he said. "If the system they're measuring is designed to change." That was the moment it clicked. Not just for her. For everyone in the room. This wasn't a trap built on deception. It was a system built on adaptation. The coalition had entered a space where every variable, every civilian structure, every logistical route, every dormant relay, could shift in response to their presence. Not randomly. Not chaotically. Deliberately. "They're trying to stabilize it," the junior officer said, watching the coalition's formation struggle to maintain cohesion. "They think they can correct for it." They can, Hale said. The pause. Individually. Imani's breath slowed as the full implication settled in. But not all at once, she finished. The coalition advanced another layer deeper. And that was when the delays began. Not in movement. In response. Command signals took milliseconds longer to propagate. Coordination between ships lost perfect synchronization. Microlags, barely measurable, but enough to disrupt the precision their entire doctrine relied on. They're losing timing, the officer said. And they don't know why, Hale added. Across coalition command channels, the tone shifted. Not panic. Not yet. But something had changed. Requests for recalibration increased. Secondary systems activated. Redundancies engaged, not because anything had failed, but because something no longer aligned. They still think it's manageable, Imani said. They have to, Hale replied. Their entire strategy depends on it. Another hour passed. The task force pressed forward, deeper into the corridor, deeper into a system that continued to behave just within the boundaries of explainable error. But those boundaries were shrinking. They're committing more resources, the junior officer reported. Reinforcement request just went out. Hale's gaze didn't waver. Of course it did. Because from the coalition's perspective, the solution was simple. More data. More control. More force. What they didn't yet understand, what they couldn't model, was that every additional ship, every new variable they introduced, made the system harder to stabilize. Not easier. They think they're fixing the problem, Imani said quietly. Hale finally looked at her. They are, he said. The pause. Just not the one they're actually in. That was the twist. The realization that shifted everything. Humanity hadn't built a defense to stop an invasion. They had built a system that made invasion itself unstable. A space where the deeper you went, the less control you had. On the display, the coalition's formation tightened again, forcing alignment through sheer computational power, overriding the inconsistencies through brute precision. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed. For a moment, it looked like they might push through. Then one of their supply chains collapsed. Not destroyed. Not attacked. It simply failed to arrive where it was supposed to. And for the first time, just for a second, their advance hesitated. The junior officer exhaled slowly. They felt that. Hale nodded. Yes. Imani stared at the projection, her voice barely above a whisper. And when they realize what's happening? Hale turned back to the display. They already have, he said. The beat. They just don't believe it yet. Across the corridor, the coalition's ships continued forward. Because turning back now would mean admitting something their doctrine had never prepared them to face. That the space ahead of them wasn't just hostile. It was designed. And they were already inside it. The hesitation lasted exactly 4 seconds. That was all it took for the coalition command to override it. Their formation tightened again, compensating for the failed supply chain with immediate rerouting. Backup logistics deployed. Redundant pathways activated. Their doctrine, refined over centuries of conquest, did not allow uncertainty to linger. Every disruption had an answer. Every anomaly had a correction. And yet, the corrections were beginning to stack. Reinforcements confirmed, the junior officer said, his voice steadier now, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Second wave entering the corridor. They're doubling down. Imani's gaze snapped toward Hale. That's escalation. Yes, Hale replied. They're committing more assets into an unstable system. Hale didn't blink. That's the only move they have left. On the display, new coalition signatures appeared, sleek, coordinated, powerful. The second wave entered with sharper synchronization, tighter control, more aggressive data processing. If the first task force had been careful, this one was precise. They weren't just observing anymore. They were correcting the environment. For a moment, just a moment, it worked. Navigation stabilized. Timing aligned. Supply routing recalibrated faster than before. The anomalies that had slowed the first wave were reduced, isolated, managed. They're adapting, Imani said, tension rising again. They're learning the system. Hale's eyes remained fixed on the projection. Yes, he said quietly. The pause. So are we. That line didn't make sense until it did. Because as the coalition increased its control, the system changed again. Not dramatically. Not in a way that triggered alarms. But just enough. Power fluctuations shifted location. Relay distortions migrated across nodes. Civilian structures, previously static, adjusted their positions by imperceptible margins, altering spatial references just enough to reintroduce error. They're chasing it, the junior officer said, realization creeping into his voice. Every time they stabilize one variable, another one moves. Because it's not a fixed system, Hale said. It's responsive. Imani leaned forward, her focus sharpening. It's reacting to them. Hale didn't correct her. Because that was exactly what it was doing. The coalition had entered a battle space where nothing stayed still, not because of chaos, but because of design. Every ship they added, every signal they transmitted, every correction they made, fed into a system that adjusted around them. They think they're gaining control, the junior officer said. They are, Hale replied. The beat. Locally. That distinction mattered more than anything. Across the corridor, coalition command channels began to show strain. Not panic. Not collapse. Pressure. Coordination delays increased by fractions. Nothing catastrophic, nothing obvious, but enough to force constant recalibration. Ships began relying more heavily on centralized command to maintain alignment. And that was exactly where the problem began. Central command latency rising, the analyst reported. Signal propagation degrading as system complexity increases. Imani's eyes narrowed. They're bottlenecking themselves. Hale nodded once. They're trying to control a system that scales against them. The coalition responded as expected. They expanded their command bandwidth. More signals. More coordination. More control. And with each addition, the system had more to respond to. It was subtle at first. Then it wasn't. Entire sections of the corridor began to behave differently depending on how many coalition ships occupied them. Areas that had been stable became unstable under increased traffic. Navigation drift increased in densely occupied zones. Supply chains that worked for smaller formations failed under larger ones. They're amplifying the problem, the junior officer said, his voice tightening again. They're making it worse by trying to fix it, Imani added. Hale didn't speak. Because now it was visible. Even to them. Across coalition channels, the tone shifted again. Not uncertainty. Not yet. But frustration. Requests for clarification increased. Cross-verification protocols activated. Ships began questioning data that should have been reliable. That's new, the analyst said. They're second-guessing their own readings. Hale exhaled slowly. That's where it starts. Imani looked at him. Where what starts? He didn't answer immediately. Because at that exact moment, everything changed. A new signal cut through the corridor. Not human. Not coalition. Something else. It was brief. Fragmented. Barely there. But it was enough. Coalition sensors reacted instantly, flagging it as unknown. Priority levels spiked. Command redirected resources to identify it, isolate it, control it. And just like that, their focus split. What was that? The junior officer asked. Hale's expression didn't change. A variable, he said. Imani stared at him. You introduced something new into the system? No, Hale replied. The pause. It was always there. That answer didn't comfort anyone. Because if it had always been there, then the coalition had never actually been measuring the full system. They had been measuring a simplified version. A version that only existed until they reached this depth. On the display, coalition formations began to shift more aggressively now, attempting to isolate the unknown signal, to bring it under control. And in doing so, they disrupted everything else. Navigation drift spiked. Timing delays increased. Supply chains fractured again, this time faster, harder. They're losing cohesion, the junior officer said, voice rising. Not yet, Hale said. But they're close. Across the corridor, the second wave, meant to stabilize the system, was now amplifying its instability. The more they tried to control it, the more variables they activated. And then, the request came. A reinforcement signal from Coalition Command to their outer fleets. Not cautious. Not measured. Urgent. They're calling in everything, Imani said, disbelief creeping in. They're going all in. Hale finally turned away from the display. Of course they are, he said. They don't know how to do anything else. The room went quiet. Because now the stakes had shifted again. This was no longer a test. No longer a probe. The coalition had committed. Fully. And humanity had let them. Imani's voice came softer now, but heavier. If they keep pushing, if they bring their full force into that corridor. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Hale looked back at the projection, at the expanding mass of coalition forces, at the system bending around them, at the threshold they had already crossed. They won't be fighting us anymore, he said. The pause. They'll be fighting the system. And for the first time since the ultimatum arrived, there was a question no one in that room could answer. What happens? When an empire built on control enters a war it cannot control, the blackout began without warning. Not as a system failure. Not as an attack. As a disappearance. Across the contested corridor, entire sectors of space simply went dark. Signals did not degrade, they ceased. Coalition sensors, built to penetrate nebulae, star radiation, and deep space interference, returned nothing. No noise. No distortion. Nothing. For a civilization that relied on perfect information, it was the closest thing to blindness. Signal loss across 6 sectors, the junior officer reported, his voice tight but controlled. No hostile signatures detected. No energy spikes. It's just gone. Imani leaned forward, her pulse visible in the tension of her posture. They're cutting themselves off, she said, realization sharpening her tone. Our own systems are inside those sectors too. Hale didn't look away from the projection. Yes. That includes our colonies, she pressed. Our ships. Our people. Yes. There was no hesitation. Because this had always been part of it. Across the darkened regions, humanity's systems did not panic. They did not call for guidance. They did not wait for orders. They acted. Autonomously. Civilian hubs sealed into hardened configurations. Independent command structures activated without central oversight. Supply chains rerouted using pre-embedded logic, not real-time coordination. Every node, every colony, every ship began operating as if it had already been alone for years. They're executing isolation doctrine, the junior officer said, voice lowering as he watched the data fragment into disconnected pieces. Every unit's acting independently. Imani's expression tightened. That's not a defense posture. No, Hale said quietly. It's survival. Inside the blackout, coalition forces struggled. Their command hierarchy, built on layered coordination and synchronized response, began to fracture under the loss of central control. Ships attempted to re-establish links, broadcasting at increasing power, flooding the dark with signals that returned no answers. Units fell out of alignment. Groups split. Precision eroded. They're trying to compensate, the analyst reported. Decentralizing command, shifting to local coordination. Hale nodded slightly. They've never had to rely on it. That was the difference. Human systems had been built for isolation. Coalition systems had been built for control. And now, control was gone. On the display, fragmented coalition clusters began to behave differently. Some attempted to hold position. Others pushed forward blindly. A few initiated retreat protocols, only to find their navigation references unreliable without the larger system guiding them. They're breaking formation, the junior officer said. Not yet, Hale replied. The pause. But they're losing agreement. That was worse. Because without agreement, there was no unified strategy. And without strategy, there was only reaction. Inside the blackout, something else began to emerge. At first, it looked like residual activity, faint movements, low-energy signatures drifting along the edges of coalition positions. Then it moved. Not fast. Not aggressively. But deliberately. What is that? Imani asked, eyes narrowing as the faint signatures began to cluster. Hale didn't answer immediately, because this was the line. The moment where containment ended. They're seeing it now, he said instead. Seeing what? Hale's gaze didn't waver. The rest of it. The signatures resolved slowly, not into ships, not into formations, but into patterns. Distributed systems, embedded structures, dormant assets that had never been part of the Coalition's model. Because they hadn't looked like anything that mattered. Until now. They're not fleet units, the junior officer whispered. They're infrastructure. Hale nodded. Converted. Across the blackout, the environment itself began to shift. Mining platforms reconfigured into signal disruptors. Transit hubs hardened into defensive nodes. Civilian arrays, previously invisible to military classification, activated layered countermeasures that interfered with coalition systems in ways their models had never accounted for. They turned everything into part of the fight, Imani said, the realization hitting harder now. They always were, Hale replied. The coalition reacted. Of course they did. Targeting protocols activated. Defensive measures deployed. Precision strikes launched at the newly revealed structures. And for the first time, they hit something real. Explosions flared in the darkness, brief flashes of violence in a space that had until now resisted direct conflict. But the effect was not what they expected. Destroying one node did not weaken the system. It changed it. Signals rerouted. Patterns shifted. Gaps closed by other structures adapting in real time. They're not degrading it, the junior officer said, disbelief creeping into his voice. They're feeding it. Because every action, every strike, introduced new variables, new data, new responses. The system wasn't just resisting them. It was evolving around them. Across coalition command fragments, urgency replaced precision. Orders became sharper, more immediate, less coordinated. Units began acting on incomplete information, prioritizing survival over cohesion. They're close, Hale said quietly. To what? Imani asked. He didn't answer right away. Because at that exact moment, a new alert cut through the chamber. Not from the corridor. From beyond it. Long-range detection, the analyst reported, voice tightening. High-yield energy signatures, outside the blackout zone. Imani turned sharply. That's not possible. Their main fleet. Isn't their main fleet? Hale finished. The room went still. Because that meant only one thing. The coalition wasn't just committing inside the corridor. They were preparing to escalate beyond it. Planetary strike capability, the analyst continued. They're positioning for a long-range deterrence event. Imani's voice dropped. They're going to force an end. Hale nodded once. Yes. For the first time, the coalition was abandoning its model entirely. No more measurement. No more control. Just overwhelming force. A final move to reassert dominance. Inside the blackout, their trapped forces struggled. Outside it, something far worse was coming. Imani looked at Hale, her voice steady but heavy now. If they fire. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Hale's gaze remained fixed on the expanding data. On the corridor. On the fleet beyond it. On the line that was about to be crossed. They won't, he said. The pause. Not the way they think. And that was the moment everything balanced on a knife's edge. Because if the coalition pulled the trigger, then whatever humanity had been holding back would finally be revealed. The coalition fleet outside the blackout did not hesitate. They aligned into formation with cold, mechanical precision, their energy signatures rising in perfect synchronization. This was not a tactical maneuver. It was a statement. A demonstration of overwhelming force meant to end uncertainty in a single, irreversible moment. From Earth's command chamber, the readings were unmistakable. They're charging, the analyst said, voice steady but thin beneath the weight of it. Full yield. Targeting solutions locking across multiple sectors. Imani didn't look away from the display. They're not trying to win the corridor anymore, she said quietly. They're trying to erase the problem. Hale stood motionless. Because this had always been the risk. Not that the coalition would misunderstand humanity, but that they would stop trying to understand at all. Inside the blackout, their trapped forces were already unraveling, fragmented, isolated, forced into reactions they had never been designed to make. Outside it, their command structure had chosen the only move left to a power that could no longer control the situation. Overwhelm it. Time to impact? Imani asked. 47 seconds, came the reply. The room tightened, because this was the moment where everything Hale had built, the preparation, the patience, the restraint, either held or failed completely. He stepped forward. Open a channel, he said. Imani blinked. Now. Yes. They're about to fire. Hale didn't look at her. That's why it has to be now. The channel connected instantly. No delay. No protocol. The coalition command did not ignore him. Because even now, even here, they were still listening. Their lead commander appeared, not as a diplomat this time, but as a decision-maker. There was no performance left in his posture. No assumption of control. Only focus. You have chosen escalation, Hale said, his voice calm, level, cutting through the rising tension like something anchored far deeper than the moment. You forced it, the commander replied. The pause. You created a system that denies resolution. Hale nodded once. Yes. That answer landed harder than denial ever could have. Because it was true. The commander's gaze sharpened. Then understand this. We will resolve it. Behind him, the fleet's energy signatures peaked. 30 seconds. Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't even argue. You believe you're about to end this, he said. The beat. You're about to start something you can't measure. The commander's expression didn't change. We have measured enough. Hale's eyes held his. No, he said quietly. You measured what we let you see. 20 seconds. The chamber behind Hale remained silent. No one interrupted. No one moved. Because they all understood. This was not negotiation. This was revelation. You counted our ships, Hale continued. You mapped our defenses. You studied our behavior under pressure. His voice didn't rise. But something in it shifted. You never asked what happens when we stop responding the way you expect. The commander's silence stretched for a fraction longer than before. And in that fraction, something cracked. Not belief. Not yet. But certainty. 10 seconds. The coalition fleet held formation. Energy locked. Targeting complete. Hale took one final step forward. Fire, he said. The word hit the channel like a fracture. Imani's breath caught. Hale. But he didn't stop. Fire, he repeated. And watch what you've actually been fighting. For a single, suspended moment, nothing moved. Then the coalition fleet unleashed everything. The void lit with catastrophic energy, beams of annihilation cutting across space toward the corridor, toward the colonies, toward the system humanity had built. And then, they disappeared. Not deflected. Not absorbed. Gone. Every beam. Every strike. Every calculated vector of destruction. Vanished into a space that no longer behaved like space. The blackout expanded, not outward, but inward, folding over itself, collapsing the very geometry the coalition had relied on to project force. Their weapons had not failed. They had been applied to something that refused to exist in the way their systems required. What? The commander started, but the word didn't finish. Because now it was visible. Across the corridor, the system shifted fully, not hiding, not adapting, but revealing. The infrastructure. The colonies. The scattered, insignificant nodes they had ignored. They aligned. Not into a fleet. Not into a formation. Into a pattern. A living structure that spanned the entire battle space, every component reinforcing every other, every variable accounted for in a way no centralized system could ever replicate. You built your strategy on control, Hale said, his voice carrying through the silence that followed the failed strike. We built ours on survival. The commander stared at the display, at the impossible data flooding his systems, at the realization forming too late to change anything. You turned your civilization into a weapon, he said. Hale shook his head slightly. No, he replied. We turned it into something that can't be conquered. The difference mattered, because one invited conflict. The other ended it. Across Coalition Command, new data streamed in, revised models, recalculated projections, none of them stabilizing, none of them producing an outcome that resembled victory. For the first time, their certainty collapsed. The commander didn't speak for several seconds. Then slowly, his posture changed. Not defeat. Not surrender. Something else. Recognition. We will withdraw, he said. No negotiation. No conditions. Just a decision. Because now they understood. Not everything. But enough. The channel closed. Behind Hale, the chamber remained silent, the weight of what had just happened settling in layers too complex for immediate reaction. Imani finally spoke, her voice quieter than it had been at any point since the beginning. They'll come back, she said. Hale nodded once. Yes. They'll study this. Prepare. Yes. She looked at him fully now. And next time? Hale turned back to the display, where the corridor slowly returned, not to normal, but to something stable again, the system easing back into the quiet patterns it had worn before. Next time, he said, they won't assume. The pause. That's all we needed. Because the victory had never been about destroying the coalition. It had been about changing how they saw humanity. Across the vast distances of space, the coalition's records began to update, old classifications rewritten, assumptions erased, new notes added where certainty had once been. Humanity was no longer a developing power. No longer a predictable one. It was something else. Something that did not wait for threats to arrive. Something that prepared for them long before they existed. And in the margin of that new classification, in data that would be studied, debated, and feared, one conclusion remained, simple and unambiguous. They were ready.